Hey there, gang. I've been physically compromised by a flu-like ailment this past week. My couch here has become my home. My ears are full, my sinuses are full, my lungs are full of the most undescribable Lovecraftian horrors right now. My throat feels like it's full of red-hot nails. And like my cognition as well. It reminds me of, remember those Warner Brothers cartoons in the mid-50s when they would let the artists go super crazy and surreal, describing a nightmare? Remember that Leprechaun episode? That one? Weird ass stuff. Anyway, that's my life now. So, I feel bad enough that it might not be responsible for me to actually work on a customer's guitar right now. So I gotta come up with some kind of self-contained content, which, who knows, it might be great. Let's see how this goes. So, something a little different. My voice is going by the second. We'll see how long I can make it last. This is an actual tutorial, and that's not what my usual online adventures are really about. I occasionally give people warnings that none of this is really intended to be a how-to. This is me letting you stand beside me while I try and fix stuff. And in many cases, the outcome is up in the air. You know, we've seen things go wrong, and sometimes curveballs are thrown. But really, you're along for the ride, and I'm careful not to say, do this, then do this, and everything will work out. Because I don't know what your skill level is, dear viewer. I don't know if you have the tendency to panic. I don't know if you understand certain concepts. I try and convey a lot of information, and I try not to hide when mishaps happen. But if you think you can watch a video and be reassured that you'll have a positive experience with your own guitar, you might be in for tears and consternation. I have had people email me with all kinds of nasty words because their very first attempt to emulate something they've seen me do did not go how they expected on their own guitar. So, consuming media is not a replacement for hands-on experience. We can absorb concepts and get ideas, we all do, but you might also need to practice this stuff. Recently I had someone reach out about a concept I mentioned a few weeks ago, both on Instagram and in a YouTube video, and I was asking, what do people charge for a refret between the nibs these days? And I was careful to say that I just wanted to hear from peers who actually do that job, not speculation. And of course, social media, the signal-to-noise ratio immediately took over, and I had to wade through all kinds of countless, strangely and possibly ill-informed opinions. But what I took away from that is that most people charge a little more than twice their regular rate for a standard bound fretboard, refret. And that varies depending on location. Someone in rural Arkansas does not charge what a person with comparable skill in New York City does. It's just simple economics. The repair person in Manhattan probably pays more in shop overhead in a day than what the Arkansas business does in a week, or more. A couple of charming gentlemen berated everyone else in the thread and stated that they charge exactly the same for any refret, nibs or no, whether it's bound or not, and I refuse to engage with that energy. That is obvious trolling. So, why save the nibs on a Gibson-style guitar? A couple of recent repair requests came from people who asked if I could. One of these was from a gentleman with a Tokay Les Paul, which you'll probably see in a video. It's on the schedule. It's a really nice clone. The other was a 2002 Les Paul Standard player's guitar. It has lots of buckle rash, chunks missing out of it. There's a heavy scratch right through the logo on the headstock. So I asked this person, why do you want to keep the fret nibs? And the answer was that he'd been looking at guitars on the feed of True Vintage Guitar, which is a shop owned by John Schultz in Alabama. John extols the virtues of a between-the-nib refret. And he's not wrong, because he's John Schultz, and he's dealing with Gibson guitars that are in the high five into the six-figure area, For the most part, they're exceptionally well-preserved instruments with unbelievably high values. In the $100,000 price range, these are not really players' grade instruments, And the people who are buying them certainly don't spend a lot of time playing them on the road. They're investment material. An extra $500 on the refret cost does not even register in those prices. The thing is, of course, once you've refretted it, are you then immediately going to start the devaluation process by putting wear on them? You know, that's a decision the owner gets to make. The thing is, this attitude sometimes filters into the consciousness of the local open mic player, and they're worried about ruining the collectability of their modern instruments that are already in rougher shape than the ones that they're looking at online. A Les Paul built in 2002 is unfortunately not going to realize the appreciation values of one made in 1959, even if it's owned and played by a famous guitarist. But what about a gold top made in 1970? You know, the decision gets harder as the value increases. Some of these guitars are still being played. Some of them are also on the cusp of being collector's instruments. So if the player is convinced that they still need the fret nibs, which is a cosmetic decision mostly, they then have to find someone who will agree to take the extra time and aggravation involved in refretting that way. And guess what? There aren't very many people who will. I've gotten pretty good at convincing people not to, and most repair people I know are exactly the same way. I've done exactly 4 between the nibs refrets in 26 years. There's a young compatriot of mine who has done 0, and not that he even has one at hand, he was just eager to learn how. So I'll show you and him my method. Other people obviously have their own techniques. This is not the be-all end-all. Let's talk about nibs and how they're made. We'll mock up a Gibson board to work on. I think it's safe to assume it's Gibson. There have been a few other luxury brands that do this, mostly individual luthiers basing their designs on Gibson practice. The way Gibson does is, by fretting the board first. I'm working with a 3-fret model here. I'll give it some taper. I'm using vintage jumbo wire, which is about 103 thousandths wide, pretty typical. I'll snip off the excess, and then in Gibson style, the ends of the frets are filed flush with the board before the binding is applied. I'll glue on some binding. Different eras, it could be different material. I think this is ABS. It's about 1/16 of an inch wide. I'll mark the nib width by using a razor blade, guided along the fret length and pressing down, give myself an indentation. I'll use a file to remove most of the excess, and the razor blade again to scrape. Things are sanded. At this stage in a vintage Gibson, the frets would be leveled with a beam, leaving a profile that was kind of flat on top. The worker would take some sandpaper and sort of flop over the edges to relieve that sharp corner. Then the angled file holder was used to create a bevel which ran from the edge of the fret down through the plastic nib material. They're kind of angled. A little more finish sanding, and there we have what is a pretty good facsimile of the Gibson fret nib. Now then, that was old school Gibson. If it's a guitar made after a certain point, which I think was in the sort of mid-80s, I believe 1986, but I can't be sure, the binding started incorporating a tongue and groove feature that slipped into a channel routed in the side of the board. This is important to note because there's a temptation to try and just sort of peel the binding off, do the frets like Gibson originally would, and then glue it back on in place. And there are people who contend this is the way that they do it. It is very difficult to pull this T-shaped binding off and put it back on again in the same place. And frequently the old binding has cracks that form at the position of every fret slot. Try and strip that binding off, you'll wind up with 44 little pieces in your hand. Why does this happen? And keep in mind, this is important to consider when we're putting the new frets in. It's because we could be baking in additional stress during the refret. In the case of a guitar refretted in summer with frets that are very snug fit between the nibs, that wood might be a bit swollen, and when it dries out, the ends of the frets push relentlessly against the binding to the extent that they can pop off the nibs, In some cases, the binding will separate. In other cases, it's actual chunks that can blow out. So sizing the frets is extremely important. If they're too short, gaps will be left, sometimes big enough to fit an E string into, which is very annoying. If they're too long, you might be promoting cracks in the binding. What happens if this is someone's $30,000 Les Paul? And, 12 months later, this is what's happened. That would be bad. Next issue. What if the fretboard is worn? Are there deep grooves in the lower positions from years of fingernails doing their thing? How do you dress those out while maintaining the nibs? It's functionally not possible. Maybe you can fill these with something, but then again, the whole thing is maintaining the originality and the look. I don't know if you do. Hopefully your customer accepts that. If there's twist or abnormal warping in the neck, there's no way to really fix that with the nibs in place. So let's pull those freshly installed frets back out. Nothing too scary here if you're used to doing refrets. And obviously extra care is taken not to disturb or damage the nibs. There they are. That's what all the fuss is about. Next up, accurate measurement. For this I use a dowel caliper with the outside jaws to measure between the nibs. And I do this a couple of times until I'm convinced that I have it right. There are people who apparently eyeball this. They cut the fret somewhere close, nibble a little bit off, check it again, nibble a little bit more, and this fret may or may not have extra spring in it, so it could not be the exact measurement when it's down in the slot, That scares me. I cut my frets slightly oversized, and then I notch the ends of the tangs exactly as if I was doing a standard fret over the binding refret. There's a little tab there, you see? That means that end of the fret is not going to be pressing against the binding ever. Here's the overkill part, but this is the way I figured out to give me perfect accuracy every time, first time. I make a surrogate fretboard. It's not the full board, just a short little section. It's a little wider than the widest fret that I need. And it's the same radius, which on a Gibson is usually 12 inches, could be 10 on some early models. It's got fret slots wide enough to accommodate the fret tang, so the fret crown just rests on the wood. It's not held by the tang at all. So with careful measurement, I need to plane down this dummy board so it's exactly the right width at the fret slot, using the calipers and the dimensions I had noted previously. Then I have this little gantry-like jig made with two toggle clamps that exert pressure on the wire and keep it in place. I do not put a whole lot of extra radius in the wire. It was rolled to rest perfectly on the surface of the board. So I can take this out, put it onto the actual fretboard, and it's going to fit exactly the same. I dress down the ends of the wire using a small safe edge file here until they're just perfectly flush with the edges of the board. Tap it in place, and it fits perfectly. No resizing. No gaps. Nice and snug. Let's do that again. We'll measure the size, plane the dummy board to size, clip the wire to length, nip the tang. There'll need to be a slight adjustment of the distance of the clamps for every new setup. So 22 times you're going to be doing that. But we'll clamp it in place, file the ends of the fret flush with the board, line the fret up with the slot. It fits really nicely between the nibs. Knock in the ends and center. Make sure it's well seated. I wick in a little super glue along the edges of each fret and on the ends where the nibs contact, locking everything in place. So we're back to the stage where I would be leveling the frets and refining the ends. But there you go. That is how I do a fret job between the nibs. Thanks for watching.